We're going to talk about something really interesting today. Okay.
If you don't make that, the black box shows up and social does that every single presentation.
All right, guys. Today we're going to talk about defense spending. And you're probably like, why? Why would we even talk about that? Well, it's a hot button issue right now. And for many reasons. Why? Because there's a lot of campaign promises that came out in February. And one that was really big is that the Donald Trump administration was going to increase defense spending by $54 billion. And for anyone who knows the history of defense spending, this is a lot of money. And if we look at this right here, if you add $54 billion to where we're at currently, that's more than all the past wars, except for the biggest war in history. So a lot of people were asking, why are we doing this right now? And to show you where we got this validity and kind of where we got our facts from, we always turn to Donald Trump's Twitter. Okay, we know that this has some reliable things. And these are actually kind of contradictory. In both these tweets, he was kind of talking about Boeing and how they're ripping us off with jetliners and how he was going to negotiate and cancel order and do things like that. However, he's going to increase the defense budget by $54 billion. So I don't really know what's going on here. But there was another person who was pretty confused and was losing sleep and had a couple aneurysms. And that was Bernie Sanders. Bernie was not happy about this. And right after that tweet, when he was going to bed around 4 p.m., he's old. He talked about that we spend more than the next 12 nations combined on defense. And that's true. So we need to look into this because there's obviously two contrary sides. And what we're going to do instead of talking about politics, we're going to be Ben Bernanke right here. We're going to kind of take away all this political discourse and tell you what economics are behind defense spending, whether we should do it or whether we should not. And we want you to decide on this, so make sure to pay attention during this because you guys are going to be voicing your opinion. So to do this, we're going to talk about the American budget, we're going to talk about international arms, the economic arguments on both sides. We're going to show you a couple models that might defend whether we should spend more or spend less, and the pros and cons that are going to stem from such. And start from that, we're going to talk about the American budget and how much we've been spending currently with us. Let's get this party started.
All right. So like Connor said, we're going to start off by looking at the American budget, military spending. How does it work? So this is just sort of budget 101. This is how I'm sorry, could you actually record?
Yeah, we're going to go outside.
It's divided into two sort of major categories of spending. You got your autopilot spending, which is mandatory spending. It's set by law, certain proportion or amounts that the government has to spend in certain areas. And then you have discretionary spending, which is what we're going to be interested in today, because it's actually money that's freely allocatable according to how Congress wants to move, depending on the administration, political climate, the law set in place. This discretionary spending is 100% up to the government to decide how to spend. So with that being said, this is the 2015 discretionary spending in the chart here. So total discretionary spending was 1.1 trillion, and this should alarm some of you guys. 54% of that was spent on military. 54% of the money that we can decide what to do with, only on the military. You have education, 6%. Veterans benefits, 6%. 54% of the military. So pretty significant. So this is kind of sort of the evolution of how we've been spending our money since 1962. Deceptively, military spending as a percentage of overall expenditures has actually been decreasing over time. But it's really going to help when we look at it in real terms what this actually means and why it's deceptive. So in nominal terms, yeah, we decreased from 50% in 1962 to 22% in 2011. But in real terms, so adjusted for inflation, GDP in 1962 was only $3.38 trillion. GDP in 2016 was $18.56 trillion. So 51% of 3.38 trillion is 1.749 trillion. 22.6% of 18.56 trillion is 4.19%. So there's actually a real increase of 239% over this time period. So now, this is why we're here. This is for you guys to decide, is it really necessary? As Connor alluded to before, defense spending in billions of dollars. We spend more than the next 12 nations. I only have 8 up here, or 7 up here, but as much as the next 12 combined. We spend almost $600 billion. And even China, who's known to have a pretty sizable military, is only spending less than a third of what we're spending on our military. So again, pretty alarming stuff. So now hypothetically, let's say we were to spend as much as the runner-up China. So we would still give ourselves, the tied for biggest military in the world with the most capabilities. We're spending $146 billion, and we have $450 billion to freely allocate however we want to allocate. Remember the Bernie's College for All Act that the Republicans were freaking out about? Please don't derive any political discourse from this. I'm just making a comment. That was only $75 billion. So compare that to the money, to the excess money that we're spending. $450 billion versus $75 billion. Pretty crazy. $450 billion a year gets us 1/3 of the way to universal health care. So that's before raising taxes or changing policy or getting big pharma companies to lower the price of medication. Just ceteris paribus, as things are right now, we're 1/3 of the way to universal health care. $450 billion pays 9 million teacher salaries of $50,000. So now we're talking about how in certain urban areas maybe there's a shortage of teachers. We could add 9 million teachers and pay them a yearly salary of $50,000, which is above the average salary with the amount of money that we're saving to still maintain the biggest military in the world. It could purchase every single resident of the United States a 13-inch MacBook Pro, souped up, top of the line, ready to go. Everyone gets one for this price. Unfortunately, econ textbooks are pretty expensive. They can only buy 6 extra textbooks. You guys know how it is. Yeah, so you guys get the idea. We're spending way too much on this in our day. Well, maybe just mine. So now that we've covered national spending, we're going to look at global spending with our friend Sir.
I've officially come a full circle because I started off as a business associate my freshman year. But like Austin mentioned, the United States spends as much as the next few countries combined. And actually, if you look at the United States versus the next top 14 countries in military spending, it's only a $66 billion difference. So that's huge. And when it comes to global spending, we account for over a third of all international military spending. But when it comes to actual percentage of GDP, the United States is not really amongst the top. It's actually centered around here that it seems like countries are spending a big portion of their GDP on the military. And leading that is actually Oman, which spends about 16% of their GDP on their military, and Saudi Arabia spends about 12% of their GDP on military. So that's a pretty sizable portion of the country's economy. But overall, if you do look at military expenditures as a portion of global GDP throughout the years, it's been declining. As you can see, in 1988, military expenditures accounted for about 3.5% of global GDP, and it's been declining since then. And while there was a spike after 9/11 because of the 2 wars that the United States entered, it's almost gone back down to its 2000 levels, which is about a little over 2% of GDP. There's 2 big players when it comes to international arms trade, and the first are these big corporations known as government contractors. And these are big public or private companies that bid for government contracts that are worth billions and billions of dollars. So that's why it's so controversial in our government to decide how much to allocate to each government contractor and how many contracts to give out, because these are really sizable chunks of government money. You've probably heard of the largest ones. There's Intel, BAE Systems, Lockheed Martin, and Boeing. And what's interesting is that all of the top companies that contract to international and to the United States government almost all of them are based in the United States except for one. So not only is the US a big consumer of military weapons, but we're also the biggest producer. The only company that is not based in the United States is BAE Systems, which is actually UK based, but their US subsidiary accounts for over 50% of all their sales anyways. And the combined arms sales of the top 100 companies in 2012 was about $400 billion. So to put that in perspective, that's over twice the amount of the entire US agricultural economy. When it comes to countries, the largest exporters, like I mentioned, are the United States, and then we also have Russia, China, Germany, and France. And between the years of 2010 and 2014, they accounted for about 75% of all exports. And the largest importers are actually they're all in Asia. We have India, Saudi Arabia, China, UAE, and Pakistan. And between the same years, they account for about a third of all imports. So clearly countries are spending a lot of their money and accumulating a lot of arms. And since the Cold War, people have realized how dangerous it has become to accumulate arms and gather a lot of dangerous weapons. And this has led to countries enacting a lot of international multilateral agreements in order to regulate arms and promote international peace. So two treaties that I want to highlight are the Arms Trade Treaty, which became, the first one is the Arms Trade Treaty. It became effective in 2014, and it's a multilateral agreement between 91 countries that have ratified it and 133 countries that have signed it. And the main point of the treaty is to regulate international arms, to promote international peace and better relations amongst nations. So as you can see, almost all the countries are either in favor of it or they abstain from voting, but hardly any of them actually oppose the treaty. The second one, which is, I think, particularly relevant in today's atmosphere, is the New START Treaty, and it's between the United States and Russia to replace the Treaty of Moscow. And the whole point of this treaty is to reduce the nuclear launchers that both countries hold, especially after the Cold War when it became really relevant. But Trump has continued to denounce this treaty, saying it's one of the bad agreements that Obama has negotiated, that it only benefits Russia but doesn't benefit us. So it'll be interesting to see whether he actually upholds this agreement and whether he carries out with the reduction of arms, or if he actually does end up increasing our military budget by $54 billion. So this leads all to the last point I want to make, which is that international trade of arms has become very, very politicized. When Eisenhower was president, leading up to the main years of the Cold War, he argued that, or he predicted that there would be something called a military-industrial complex, which he said was that there was going to be an integration between armed forces, commerce, and politics. And that's exactly what's happened in the United States over the years. If you look at this chart, it's a percentage of who says spending on the military is too little. And here you have the Republicans, and here you have the Democrats. And this differential right here over the past 5 years has remained completely constant. It's been about 30% over the years. So it seems like even though both parties have seemed to think that over the years there should have been an increase in spending, that the differential between the two is the exact same. So it's a very politicized issue. And as we continue to become increasingly isolationist and continue to accumulate a lot of global arms, it'll be interesting to see how public opinion changes and how countries manage to actually regulate their arms. So with that, I'll hand it over to Victoria, who's going to talk about the politicization and economic models.
So, again, I'm doing the really riveting part of this presentation, so bear with me. But basically, depending on your political leaning and what economic school of thought you identify as, there is a model for you on whether or not we should be increasing or decreasing defense spending. So obviously Donald Trump has been tweeting a lot about how we're going to get jobs from that, and that falls under the military Keynesianism model. And what this model basically says is that military spending falls under government spending, and it has a lot of the same outcomes of an increased government budget. So there's crowding out. So basically, private firms aren't investing as much as they would normally be because the government is investing so much. Reduce unemployment, so if we're increasing the size of our military, obviously people are going to be getting jobs. And then lastly, there's a lot of externalities that come from it. And then obviously, I think everyone learned this in either 102 or 104, but basically the argument between guns or butter. So whenever we choose to allocate resources and funds to the military, it means we're taking it away from some other aspect of our budget. So if we are doing that, we can't spend as much money on Social Security or other things that might have even better impacts on our economy. Then another model that we have is the augmented solo model, and this is basically done by Mankiw, and there's all these assumptions with this model and variables that are inputted into it, and basically what they've said, a lot of critiques on this model is that it doesn't take into account all of the variables that go into government spending today. So obviously we're on a global scale, and every time we choose to increase our military, there's different circumstances. So issues with the current models today. Either the models are very, very strong theoretically, but then don't match up with any data that we have, so they're basically useless, or the models are so narrow that they can't predict actual outcomes. And this is really easy to see in a bunch of different wars over history. So what? Why are people, if we had a great model, why wouldn't Congress just use that and use that to determine whether or not we should increase it? And basically that's because there aren't really any great models out there. What we would need to do to create a model would to take into account every variable that is happening in an economy and then try to predict it. And two good cases of looking at this to see whether or not it would be able to work would be World War II and the Gulf War. So in World War II, it basically drug us out of a recession or a depression and made it so that our economy was growing rapidly. And those circumstances are very different than the Gulf War, in which there was a massive savings glut, and that didn't happen. So the larger takeaway is that depending on what's happening in the economy, there will be different outcomes of increasing government spending. It's not necessarily if you increase government spending, your economy will grow. And with that being said, Gersham's going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of defense spending.
Thank you. Okay. So before we weigh the advantages versus disadvantages, we want to make sure we're careful not to just make a quick judgment like my friend here, Connor. Okay. All right, so first advantage, we're at number 1. So as best said by Drake, we started from the bottom, now we here. So as from prior slides, U.S. accounts for a little over a third of worldwide military spending, so that's a lot. China's second at 12%, so just to put that into context. Another reason why we're number 1 is because it has to do with our foreign policy. We're like the military police of the world. So that's also another reason why we are number 1. The disadvantage to this is because we spend so much on our military, our allies have no incentive to spend on their military because we have their backs. So that's a disadvantage. A second advantage is that fiscal spending can boost the economy. So when you're spending $600 billion a year, a lot of the jobs are supported, but also it's sort of hard to measure the effect because there's always circumstances. However, spending in research and development does lead to further gains further down the line, especially to civilians. So that's something to note. The disadvantage to this is because it's such a large chunk of money being spent, it's highly political in nature in terms of allocation. So first you have this problem that there's no private solution to military because that's the government responsibility. Second is sentiment for or against the military come ebbs and flows. And that was like one of the reasons why Obama wanted to withdraw troops. So that's an example, recent example. A third advantage is that research and development leads to breakthroughs in applicable technology. So you have radar, satellite, internet, a host of things that you can just thank the military for spending our hard-earned money on. So another one is a Jeep. So I see lots of Jeeps around here. So, but without the military spending on that, it wouldn't be there. It's also an inefficient means of allocation because it's so big. If you spend $1 billion on military spending, it creates the least amount of jobs. There's several factors due to that, but compared to other industries like healthcare, education, clean energy, military ranks towards the bottom in terms of number of jobs created. An advantage to all this spending is that soldiers are less at risk of harm, whether that's injury or death, than prior years. So that's to do with safety equipment, intel, weapons. Lots of things now are trying to reduce the risk soldiers face in everyday battle. At the same time, modern warfare is no longer defined the same way as it was in prior years. So nowadays, countries have to intel gathering, it's a huge one with data, or they can resort to currency manipulation, or trade coalitions such as OPEC, NAFTA, amongst numerous others. So that's just something to keep in the future. And then a fifth advantage is that there's access to strategic So air, ground, water, space. So what this means is that in our modern way of living, we rely a lot on goods being transported internationally or with minimum barriers to trade. So that's, an example would be like oil. Like oil is transported through shipping containers, and like if there's more barriers to trade for that, that'd be just a logistical nightmare. So that's a huge plus for our modern way of living. And on that note, we will now go to the assignments. So we have a fun homework for you guys. Connor, I'll give it to Connor.
All right, it's not really a homework, although you guys can send something to the Canvas page, one-page paper. Just kidding. Everyone's like, screw you. What we want to do for this one, we're going to kind of switch it up a little bit. We want you guys to split into groups. It looks like everyone's kind of in the back, but we're kind of divide you. You guys could go around and pick like kind of your section.
Why don't you just count to 4?
Yeah.
Okay,
Let's do
that's a
that.
good idea.